The sea was black glass, fractured only by the slow churn of diesel exhaust rising from the conning tower of U-553. Frost lined the deck guns, and the iron hull groaned as waves slapped against it in a slow, rhythmic violence. Inside, the air was thick with sweat, oil, and triumph. Kapitänleutnant Hans-Jürgen Offen, a gaunt 30-year-old from Bremen with a face prematurely aged by salt air, stood in the conning tower, hands gripping his binoculars as if the Atlantic itself were his possession. This was his ocean. Offen and his men were veterans of the Zweite Glückliche Zeit, the second happy time, the months when German U-boats had hunted American and Allied shipping along the North Atlantic and US East Coast with impunity. Between January and August 1942, the Kriegsmarine's undersea fleet had sunk nearly 3.1 million tons of Allied shipping, tankers, freighters and troopships alike, sending burning steel and screaming men into icy graves. The BDU, Befehlshaber der U-Boote, under Admiral Karl Dönitz, called it Tonnage Krieg, the tonnage war. Every 1,000 tons sunk brought the Allies one step closer to starvation. To Offen, it felt like destiny. Another convoy torn apart off Halifax, his watch officer, Lieutenant Zursi Franz Becker, said with a grin. The Americans still sail with their lights blazing at night. It's madness. Offen smiled faintly. They believe in visibility. We believe in the deep. Laughter rippled through the conning tower. They had reason to be confident. Since departing Lorient 2 weeks earlier, U-553 had already claimed 3 ships, the SS Muskogee, a 7,000-ton tanker, the Empire Birch, a British cargo vessel, and an American freighter whose name they never learned. Each had gone down in flames, unescorted and helpless. The Kriegsmarine War Diary, BDU KTB, February 1942, recorded the same mood across the fleet. The Atlantic is ours. Our wolf packs operate freely from Greenland to the Caribbean. Convoys are weak, escorts inexperienced. Our submariners strike as they please. The enemy bleeds faster than he can recover. For Dönitz, this was vindication. He had long believed that a concentrated submarine campaign against Britain's supply lines could strangle the island nation into submission. With only 300 operational boats, the Kriegsmarine lacked the numbers for a surface war, but beneath the waves they could fight asymmetrically and win. Each Rudel, or wolf pack, operated like a predator's circle. A lone boat shadowed a convoy, reporting its position via encrypted Enigma message to BDU headquarters at Kerneval near Lorient. Then, under Dönitz's direction, up to a dozen U-boats converged, attacking at night on the surface, where their diesel engines gave them speed and their silhouettes vanished against the horizon. British records from the Admiralty's loss summary for early 1942 describe the effect bluntly. The North Atlantic has become a graveyard of steel. In January alone, 50 merchant vessels, totaling over 320,000 tons, were lost to submarine attack. Convoy defences remain inadequate. Offen took pride in those numbers. Each ton of destroyed shipping was another victory in the invisible war, another entry in the BDU's nightly radio bulletin, Erfolgreiche Boote, the list of successful submarines. U-553 had been mentioned twice that winter. Still, life aboard the boat was claustrophobic. 52 men crammed into a steel cylinder barely 220 feet long. The stench of diesel fuel mingled with unwashed bodies and the ever-present tang of rust. Condensation dripped from the ceiling in cold rivulets. Sleep came in 3-hour shifts, meals in tin trays, and privacy was a myth. Yet morale was high. Offen's crew were believers in the mythos Dönitz cultivated, that of the U-boot farer, knights of the deep, Germany's elite. "Radio from Lorient," radioman Oberfunkmat Kruger called out. Offen ducked back into the control room, stooping under pipes. Kruger handed him the decoded slip. From BDU, convoy ON-67 sighted west of Ireland. Wolfpack Hecht ordered to intercept. Maintain position and report weather. Dönitz. Offen tapped the chart table. We hold station near Newfoundland, he ordered. Let Hecht take that one. Our hunting grounds are rich enough. He had learned to trust his instincts more than headquarters. Out here, on the ragged edge of the North Atlantic, command was an illusion. You lived or died by sound, by the rhythm of sonar pings, by the hiss of air rushing into ballast tanks. The ocean was an enemy that crushed hesitation. That night, they found prey again. A lone freighter, silhouetted against the faint aurora, plodded eastward. No escort, no radar. Offen ordered a surface attack, 2 torpedoes fired at 600 meters. The first struck amidships. The second, seconds later, ignited the fuel tanks. A thunderclap rolled across the waves, orange flame reflecting on the wet steel of U-553's deck. The crew erupted in cheers. Offen watched silently, the glow flickering in his eyes. In his patrol log, later captured and archived in the U.S. Navy's Atlantic Fleet records, he wrote, February 8, 1942. Freighter sunk, approximate 6,000 tons. Position 47 degrees north, 52 degrees west. Crew morale high. Sea state moderate. The Atlantic yields her tribute. But beneath the arrogance, cracks were forming. Allied intelligence, through the British Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Centre, had begun intercepting Enigma traffic more frequently. The first convoy systems under Admiral Sir Max Horton were reorganising into escort groups with corvettes and destroyers, and across the Atlantic, in Washington and Norfolk, the US Navy was learning fast. Still, to Offen, these were rumours. Let them come, he told Becker one night, watching the northern lights shimmer through the periscope lens. The ocean belongs to the wolf, not the shepherd. By March 1942, U-553 had completed her 5th patrol with 6 confirmed sinkings, earning Offen the Knight's Cross. His photograph appeared in the Völkischer Beobachter under the caption, Guardian of the Atlantic Lifeline. Propaganda painted him as a New Age corsair, part engineer, part predator, fighting for Germany's survival. But the reality, recorded in the Kriegsmarine's BDU diary for May 1942, was far less romantic. Losses increasing. Allied air patrols extend further west. Our boats report radar detection. The sea grows dangerous. Offen never saw that entry. To him, the war was still a game of patience and precision, a test of nerve. From his perspective, the Atlantic remained vast and ungovernable, its storms and mists a cloak for Germany's invisible fleet. Yet somewhere beyond the horizon, in a Norfolk operations room lit by flickering radar screens, the first American hunter-killer group was forming, a new kind of predator, forged not in stealth but in coordination. The wolves of the deep would soon learn that the Atlantic no longer belonged to them. North Atlantic, Spring 1943. The ocean was no longer silent. By the spring of 1943, the North Atlantic had transformed from a hunting ground into a killing field, not only for merchantmen, but for the hunters themselves. The days when U-boats prowled unchallenged beneath moonlit seas were fading fast. The Allied convoys had adapted, and the air above the ocean was now filled with the drone of engines, the watchful eyes of liberators, Sunderlands, and wildcats. On board U-553, Kapitänleutnant Hans-Jürgen Offen stood once again in the conning tower, though now the confident gleam in his eyes had dimmed. The horizon was grey and endless, snow flurries sweeping over a steel-coloured sea. Below decks, his crew moved with a practised, haunted rhythm, quieter now, warier. "Hydrophone contact, bearing 220, the sound operator shouted suddenly. Offen's head snapped toward the periscope well. "Merchantman?" "Negative, Herr Kaleon. Twin propeller. Probably a corvette." The tension in the control room tightened instantly. Gone was the laughter of 1942, the easy arrogance of the happy time. Every sound now carried the weight of death. "Rig for silent running," Offen ordered calmly, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The electric motors hummed to life as U-553 slipped deeper into the grey abyss, descending past 70 metres, 90, 110. The pressure gauge trembled. The hull creaked like an old tree in a storm. Above them, the hunter waited. The Allied convoy system had evolved into a deadly science. What had once been a line of merchant ships scattered across miles of sea was now a coordinated armada, escorted by destroyers, corvettes, and increasingly, aircraft carriers. The British Bogue class and American Casablanca class escort carriers patrolled the North Atlantic like mobile fortresses, launching patrols that could scour the waves for submarines from hundreds of miles away. In one of his few recorded war diary entries that spring, Offen wrote, "The enemy has learned. Their escorts no longer chase ghosts. They listen, they plan, and they attack in unison. The Atlantic has turned against us." Yet he pressed on. BDU headquarters in Lorient, still under Admiral Dönitz's iron discipline, ordered U-boats into ever larger wolf packs: Seawolf, Raubgraf, Gruppe Amsel. The hope was that sheer numbers could overwhelm convoy escorts, but it was a desperate gamble. In April 1943, U-553 was assigned to Wolfpack Amsel II, tasked with intercepting convoy ONS-5, westbound from Liverpool to Halifax. 50 merchant ships, 20 escorts, a floating city crawling across the Atlantic. Dönitz himself described it in the BDU log as a decisive engagement. For the first time, the Germans deployed over 40 submarines to strike a single convoy. Offen knew the odds. 40 against 20 escorts, he muttered to Becker, his weary first officer. It's no longer a hunt, it's a siege. The attack began under a moonless sky on May 4, 1943. U-553 surfaced at midnight, joining a line of dark shapes ghosting through the waves. Flares burst across the horizon as British destroyers fired star shells, lighting the sea in eerie white flashes. The Allied convoy zigzagged, its escorts weaving in and out like wolves of their own. Offen launched 2 torpedoes at a shadowed silhouette, the SS Harperley, a British freighter. The explosion was immediate, violent. The ship listed, burning, before sliding into the black. The crew of U-553 cheered, briefly, but the celebration died when sonar picked up the telltale rhythm of depth charges rolling off a destroyer's stern. "Dive! Dive!" Offen roared. They plunged into the deep. The first explosion hit close, too close. The boat lurched violently, gauges shattered, lights flickered. Then came another, and another. The sea itself seemed to scream. "Depth 150 metres!" Becker shouted. "We're below safe limit!" "Hold her steady!" Offen barked, gripping the periscope handles. "Level her out at 170!" Metal groaned. The men clutched their stations in silence, eyes wide. Then the concussions stopped. Only the hiss of air and the soft dripping of condensation remained. Hours passed before they dared surface again. The ocean was littered with wreckage, burning oil, lifeboats, debris. In the distance, faint flashes marked where other U-boats were still fighting, dying. The wolf pack that had once symbolized German supremacy was being slaughtered. In the BDU war diary for May 6, 1943, Dönitz recorded the outcome with characteristic restraint. Operation Amsel has failed, heavy losses, contact broken, enemy radar and air patrols effective, 17 boats missing. Among them, U-553 was listed as presumed lost. But Offen survived, barely. His submarine had limped away with a damaged hull and broken pumps, forced to surface only at night and run east toward France. The journey took 10 days through storm and fear. Each dawn they dove to avoid aircraft. The enemy now ruled not just the sea, but the sky. When they finally reached Lorient, the once proud submarine pens were half ruined by Allied bombing. Oil fires burned on the horizon. Dock workers moved like ghosts through the rubble. Offen stood on the pier, staring at the Atlantic, its grey waves glinting with oil slicks and memory. "Do you think we'll ever win this war, Herr Callan?" Becker asked quietly beside him. Offen didn't answer. His eyes were fixed westward, toward the ocean that had once obeyed him. In Berlin, the situation was turning desperate. Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park had mastered the U-boat Enigma cipher, codenamed Shark. Each radio transmission from Dönitz's headquarters was intercepted, decrypted, and relayed to Allied convoys within hours. The wolves were now walking into traps laid by men who knew their every move. Meanwhile, new Allied technologies, centimetric radar, Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars, and long-range patrol aircraft, had changed the war entirely. No longer could U-boats surface freely to recharge batteries. No longer could they count on the darkness. In one chilling passage from the U.S. Navy Atlantic Fleet's after-action report, June 1943, a commander wrote, "Where once they were predators, now they are prey. The hunter has become the hunted. The ocean belongs to no flag, but today it yields only the dead." For Offen and his surviving crew, the war at sea had become a slow drowning, not of bodies, but of belief. Their comrades were vanishing by the dozen. Each patrol meant fewer familiar faces on return. By summer, the Kriegsmarine's statistics told the story with brutal simplicity. In May 1943 alone, 41 U-boats were lost, nearly 1/4 of the operational fleet. Dönitz called it Der Schwarze Mai, Black May. Standing in his command quarters, Offen read the latest BDU order pinned to the wall. "All U-boats will continue operations. The fatherland depends upon your courage. The Atlantic must not be abandoned." He folded the paper, saying nothing. The lights flickered again from another distant bombing raid. Once, he had believed the sea was his dominion. Now it was a graveyard, silent, endless, and indifferent. And still, orders came to sail again. North Atlantic, summer 1943, aboard USS Card, CVE-11. The ocean stretched like dull iron beneath the escort carrier USS Card. Wind tore at the American flag snapping on her mast, the air stinking of salt and oil. Below decks, her pilots prepared for the morning patrol, men of Composite Squadron VC-9, trained for a new kind of warfare that fused sea and sky into one lethal equation. "Launch in 5, the deck officer shouted over the roar of engines. The flight deck trembled as a Grumman TBF Avenger rolled forward. Its crew, pilot, radio man, and turret gunner, exchanged a final glance. On its underside hung a Mark 24 Fido acoustic homing torpedo, the newest weapon in the Allied arsenal, designed specifically to chase and kill submarines. From the bridge, Captain Arnold J. Isbell watched the launch through binoculars. He was a calm man, deliberate and utterly focused. His orders from the Atlantic Fleet were clear: hunt the hunters. By mid-1943, the U.S. Navy's hunter-killer groups, built around escort carriers like Card, Bogue, and Croatan, each protected by a ring of destroyer escorts, had become the sharpest spear of the Battle of the Atlantic. They no longer waited for U-boats to find convoys. They sought them out instead, using radar, radio intercepts, and codebreakers' guidance to strike preemptively. The Allies had flipped the script. Isbell studied a map spread across the chart table. A penciled line traced a suspected U-boat transit route between the Azores and Newfoundland, a milch cow refueling corridor where long-range submarines met supply U-boats. The intelligence came from Ultra, the decrypted Enigma transmissions that now guided every major Allied hunt. "Lieutenant Commander," Isbell said, turning to his operations officer, "we're going to cut their lifeline tonight." At dawn on July 31, 1943, radar aboard the destroyer escort USS Bory picked up a faint contact, a periscope feather 20 miles southwest of Card's position. The task group swung into formation instantly. Orders crackled across radio channels. All aircraft, Vector 085, contact probable submerging. 3 Avengers peeled off into the grey mist, followed by a Wildcat fighter sweeping low. Within minutes, the Avengers operator spotted a flash of silver beneath the waves, the outline of a diving U-boat, U-66, under Kapitänleutnant Gerhard Seehausen. The Americans dropped sonobuoys in a wide arc, their underwater microphones transmitting faint propeller beats. "Target acquired," came the calm voice over the radio. The Avengers' bay doors opened. The Fido torpedo splashed into the water with a muted thunk, vanishing into the deep. It began its mechanical hum, listening, adjusting, homing. Moments later, a violent plume erupted from the sea. Oil and debris followed. From Card's flight deck, sailors erupted into cheers. The U-boat had vanished. Another kill for the hunter-killers. The Germans couldn't understand it at first. In the BDU war diary for August 1943, Dönitz wrote bitterly, "Boats are being attacked far from convoys in the open ocean where no surface escort should be. Enemy has developed a mobile base of air power. The Atlantic is shrinking. For the U-boat commanders, it was like fighting an invisible storm. The radar-equipped Avengers appeared without warning, diving from cloud banks, their depth charges erupting before the submarines could crash dive. The American destroyer escorts, Borry, Evarts, Goff, Barry, formed an unbroken cordon around their carriers, equipped with sonar, hedgehogs, and radar-guided guns. U-boat warfare was a game of stealth. The Allies had rewritten the rules. At the same time, the psychological tide was turning. In post-war interrogation transcripts, German survivors described an ocean that had become alive with enemies. One recalled, "You could not see them, but you knew they were there." The sky had ears, and the sea had eyes. Hans-Jürgen Offen, whose U-553 had miraculously limped home after Amsel, now commanded U-1225, a newer Type 9C. His men were younger now, boys, barely trained. They knew the odds. Still, they went. Sailing from Lorient in September, Offen's orders were to shadow a convoy near the Azores. But within 3 days he reported radar contact, then silence. The next entry in the BDU logs reads only, U-1225 failed to report. Presumed lost, cause unknown. In truth, she had been destroyed by aircraft from USS Card. The records in the U.S. Navy's after-action report, September 14, 1943, confirm it. Target submerged at 11:05. 2 Fido drops. Oil and debris observed. No survivors. Captain Isbell understood the grim arithmetic of the war he was fighting. Each kill meant dozens of merchant ships might reach port unmolested, food, fuel, and munitions for Europe's liberation. Yet each U-boat that went down carried 50 men into the abyss. Late one night, he stood on Card's wind-swept deck, watching phosphorescent waves curl in the dark. Beside him, Lieutenant Commander Elmore White, one of his squadron leaders, smoked silently. "Hard to believe," White murmured. "Just a year ago they were running wild." Isbell nodded. "They thought we'd never find them. That the ocean would always hide them." He gestured toward the black horizon. "But we learned to see in the dark." In London, the Admiralty and US Navy reported staggering results. Between May and December 1943, hunter-killer groups centered on Card, Bogue, and Core destroyed more than 30 U-boats, often hundreds of miles from any convoy. The Allied shipping losses dropped by half. The Atlantic was no longer Dönitz's domain. It belonged to radar, codebreakers, and relentless American aviation. The Kriegsmarine's post-action summaries reflected the despair. Enemy air-sea units possess striking range of 800 nautical miles. Convoys now screened by mobile air coverage. Night surface attacks impossible. recommend shift to long-range operations in mid-Atlantic Gap, though this too is shrinking. Still, Dönitz refused to admit defeat. He ordered new U-boat models, the Type 21 Electroboot, faster underwater, with greater endurance. But these would come too late. The factories that might have produced them were under Allied bombardment. The seas that might have tested them were already watched from above. In a report to the Oberkommando der Marine dated November 1943, an unnamed German admiral summarized the new reality. Our submariners no longer fight the enemy. They fight the ocean itself, an ocean owned by the Allies. On October 31, 1943, the USS Card group scored one of its final great victories of the year, the sinking of U-405. The destroyer escort USS Bogue detected the sub on radar, forced it to surface, and engaged in a furious close-range duel. Shells tore across the waves, sailors fired rifles, pistols, even flares. In the chaos, Bogue rammed the U-boat amidships, locking the two vessels together. Men fought across the decks in the freezing spray until U-405 slipped beneath the waves. The Americans cheered, but Bogue herself was fatally damaged and later scuttled. Captain Isbell wrote in his log, "We met the enemy in the oldest way, ship to ship, man to man. The sea took them both. It was symbolic, the final act of a changing war where courage still mattered, but machines and science had taken the lead. The Battle of the Atlantic was not yet over, but the tide had turned irrevocably. The wolf packs had been broken, their dominion shattered by those who learned to hunt the hunters. And above the grey Atlantic, the avengers of Card still roamed the sky, circling, listening, waiting. By late 1943, the grey Atlantic had changed character. The once lonely sea lanes, where German U-boats prowled unchallenged, now bristled with American steel. From the Arctic convoys to the Caribbean lanes, small flat-topped ships patrolled the horizon. Baby flat-tops, the sailors called them, though there was nothing childish about their purpose. The escort carrier, once conceived as a stopgap, had become the backbone of the Allied anti-submarine offensive. Built from merchant hulls or converted oilers, these compact vessels, classes like Bogue, Casablanca and Card, carried only 24 aircraft. Yet in numbers, coordination and endurance, they transformed the Atlantic into an American lake. Each one, noted Admiral Ernest King, is a moving airfield where there was once only water. In Washington, the numbers told the story. In 1941, the Allies had just one operational escort carrier. By 1944, they had over 70. The US Navy's shipyards, energized by the arsenal of democracy, turned out Casablanca-class carriers in less than 4 months each, 512 feet long, capable of 19 knots, and manned by 900 sailors. They were ungainly to look at, squat with narrow flight decks and stubby stacks, but their crews learned to make them deadly efficient. Every inch of deck space mattered. A Casablanca's hangar carried 8 Avengers and 12 Wildcats. Her escort screen of destroyer escorts bristled with sonar, depth charges, and radar arrays. The tactical idea was as elegant as it was ruthless. Instead of waiting for U-boats to attack convoys, the convoys would come to the hunters. The first true demonstration came in November 1943. Task Group 21.14, centred on the USS Bogue, set out to clear the North Atlantic convoy routes between Newfoundland and Gibraltar. The weather was brutal, gales that froze the catwalks in ice, waves breaking over the bow, but the crew knew their purpose. From the Bogue's Combat Information Centre, Commander J. A. Delaney recalled, "We'd sit there in the dark, watching the radar sweep like a heartbeat. Somewhere out there was a wolf pack, thinking itself invisible. We were the light that found them. The Bogue's Avengers launched in pairs, their radar sets sweeping the waves. On the third night, radar picked up a faint echo, a snorkel mast breaching the surface for a breath of air. The pilot, Lieutenant Howard Roberts, banked low through the mist. Below, the silhouette of U-86 cut across the surf. Roberts dove to 50 feet, released 2 depth charges, and pulled up just as the sea erupted in orange fire. "We never saw survivors," he wrote later. "Only oil and wood." The kill confirmed what Dönitz feared. The ocean was no longer a sanctuary. For the German crews, the psychological shock was devastating. In early 1944, captured radio intercepts from U-621 recorded panicked transmissions. Aircraft overhead, too far from convoy, impossible. The BDU headquarters at Kurneval issued increasingly desperate orders to avoid free hunting zones, patrolled by escort carrier groups. But those zones expanded weekly. What had once been the Black Pit, the mid-Atlantic gap where no Allied air coverage existed, was now closed. Dönitz's diary entry for February 1944 was bleak. "The enemy's mobile air groups are death in motion. The wolf pack cannot fight shadows. In Boston, the Bogue's success was followed by an explosion of hunter-killer formations. USS Card, operating with VC-9, claimed 8 confirmed U-boat kills. USS Croatan, hunting in the Azores corridor, destroyed 4 in one patrol. USS Core and USS Block Island scoured the Caribbean, protecting oil routes vital for the invasion of Europe. Each group operated with the same doctrine: detect, pursue, and annihilate. Every contact began with radio direction finding, the Huff-Duff network triangulating a U-boat's position from its encrypted Enigma bursts. Ultra-intelligence then provided precise bearings. Once an estimated track was plotted, the escort carrier would deploy a search box, overlapping radar and sonar patrols extending hundreds of miles. "Within days," wrote Admiral Ingersoll, "the hunters knew where the wolves would be before the wolves themselves did." The U-boats tried to adapt. They switched to night surface running, used radar detectors like Metox and Naxos, and attempted wolf pack ambushes against the carriers themselves. But even their most daring efforts failed. In December 1943, U-231 attempted a night torpedo attack on USS Card in heavy seas. She fired 4 torpedoes, all missed. Within minutes, Avengers had scrambled, dropping flares that turned the dark Atlantic into daylight. Depth charges followed. Only 16 of U-231's 49 crew were ever found. By early 1944, the German High Command realized the balance had irreversibly shifted. From January to March, 90 U-boats were sunk, nearly 1/3 of Germany's active fleet. Losses were so severe that Dönitz was forced to withdraw most boats from the North Atlantic altogether, redirecting operations toward the Arctic and Bay of Biscay. In his report to Hitler, Dönitz admitted grimly, "Our submarines no longer control the Atlantic. The enemy has found in these carriers a perfect counter to our doctrine." In Washington and London, Allied planners were already thinking ahead. With the U-boat threat contained, the escort carriers would soon escort invasion fleets, providing the same lethal air cover against coastal defences in the coming landings of Normandy and southern France. But in the Atlantic, the victory had not come cheaply. The seas claimed their share of the hunter-killers. In May 1944, USS Block Island was torpedoed by U-549 off the Canaries. The explosion tore her aft compartments apart. She sank within minutes. Yet even in death, the doctrine held. Her escorts counter-attacked and sank the German submarine within the hour. Of Block Island's 957 crew, all but 6 survived. The rescue ships pulled them from the water under the rising sun, oil-slicked and shivering. One young radio man, barely 19, told his rescuer, "We sank them, sir, and they sank us, but we were faster." The hunter-killer groups had done more than avenge the convoys. They had redefined the nature of sea warfare. Naval aviation was no longer a luxury of the big carriers. It was the new constant of naval control. Even Dönitz, in his post-war memoirs, conceded with reluctant admiration. The enemy's small carriers were the decisive factor in the Battle of the Atlantic. Not their size, but their number and persistence broke the back of our submarine campaign. As 1944 dawned, the Atlantic no longer belonged to the Wolfpack. From the decks of the Bogue, Card, Core and Croatan, the horizon was clear, steel grey, wind-swept, and for the first time in years, peaceful. The sea that once devoured men now served as a bridge, the lifeline that would carry armies to Normandy, and from there to victory in Europe. For the sailors who stood on those icy decks, watching avengers vanish into cloud and rain, the war's greatest truth had revealed itself. Dominion over the sea was no longer granted by the gun or the torpedo, but by the wing. The sea was steel grey and alive with menace. The U-boats still prowled, but the ocean no longer belonged to them. In the spring of 1943, the Wolfpacks began to learn fear, not from destroyers they could outrun, nor from depth charges they could sometimes dodge, but from something new, something relentless, the hunter-killer groups. The destroyer escort USS Bogue cut through the North Atlantic swells at 16 knots, her decks slick with rain and sea spray. Above her, a Grumman TBF Avenger circled like a hawk, radar antenna rotating from its ventral pod. On the bridge, Captain Giles Short, calm, methodical, studied the plot table. "Contact report from Intrepid," the radar officer called out. "Sonar pinged something faint, bearing 085. Short nodded once. "Helm, bring us about. Sound general quarters." Below decks, the ship came alive in a practised frenzy. Sailors ran to battle stations, hatches slammed shut, and the rhythmic ping-ping-ping of the sonar echoed through the hull. The convoy, 15 miles astern, continued toward Britain, unaware that the Bogue's group had slipped into the shadows, hunting death. The hunter-killer concept was Admiral Ernest King's answer to a losing war at sea. Since late 1942, Allied convoys had suffered staggering losses, 7 million tons of shipping sunk in less than 2 years. German wolfpacks struck in coordinated waves, surfacing at night to attack with torpedoes, their silhouettes low and invisible. Convoy escorts could only defend, they could not pursue. That changed when the Americans formed the hunter-killer groups, centered around small escort carriers like Bogue and Card, paired with destroyers and destroyer escorts equipped with new radar, sonar, and HF/DF, high-frequency direction finding. Their mission was not to guard convoys, but to seek and destroy submarines wherever they hid. It was offensive warfare, Dönitz's own tactics turned against him. U-231, under Kapitänleutnant Wilhelm Schultz, was returning from patrol near Greenland with 2 torpedoes left and a weary crew. They'd sunk a British freighter, SS Pacificus, and evaded a corvette's counterattack. The mood was cautious but proud. "If we keep to the fog," Schultz told his first officer, "we'll be home to Brest in 5 days." The hydrophone operator leaned close to his headset. "Herr Kaleun, aircraft engine noise. Faint, bearing 220. Schultz frowned. In this weather? Impossible. But the sound grew louder, a dull hum that became a scream. Moments later, the unmistakable shape of a TBF Avenger burst through the fog. It was so close they could see the gunner's face. "Alarm! Dive! Dive!" The U-boat's bow pitched down as men scrambled down the conning tower. Water rushed over the deck just as 2 depth charges splashed into the sea. The explosions came seconds later, thunder underwater, pressure slamming into the hull. The lights flickered. "Damage aft! Flooding in the engine room." Schultz steadied himself. "Level at 60 meters. Blow aft ballast." But the hunter above wasn't finished. The Avenger released a Mark 24 Fido, the Allies' new acoustic homing torpedo. Silent and deadly, it listened for propeller noise, following like a bloodhound. The crew of U-231 heard it coming. "Torpedo in the water!" Seconds later, the explosion ripped through the stern. The lights went out. U-231 went down fast, breaking apart before Schultz could give the order to surface. From above, the Avenger pilot radioed calmly. "Splash 1 U-boat. No survivors observed." The victories came fast that spring. Between March and May 1943, Allied hunter-killer groups and long-range patrols destroyed 41 U-boats, more than any period in the war. For the first time, the hunters had become the hunted. Aboard the Bogue, morale soared with each confirmed sinking. The sailors marked silhouettes of submarines on the chart room wall, yet Captain Short kept his voice measured. "Remember," he told his men, "each one of those is 50 men who'll never go home." His words carried weight. The war at sea was invisible, fought in silence and sudden death, but it was no less human. At Kerneval, Dönitz's headquarters near Lorient, the mood turned grim. Reports came in daily, U-boat after U-boat overdue or lost without trace. The BDU, U-boat Command Diary for April 1943 reads with growing despair. "Enemy air activity over mid-Atlantic now constant. Hunter carriers patrol independently, employing radar and HF/DF. Losses unsustainable. Recommend withdrawal of boats from North Atlantic routes pending tactical review." But Hitler demanded results. The Führer still believed in the U-boat as the decisive weapon, the spearhead of the tonnage war. Dönitz, torn between duty and futility, ordered new patrol lines, Group Trutz, Defiance, and Luthen, to intercept convoys near the Azores. Few would return. One of those boats was U-640, commanded by Oberleutnant zur See Karl Ernst Schröder, a 25-year-old with an Iron Cross and the weary confidence of a veteran. On May 14, 1943, his U-boat was spotted by radar-equipped Avengers from Bogue while attempting to rendezvous with a supply sub, a Milchkur. Schröder dived too late. The depth charges found him. Oil and debris surfaced 20 minutes later. It was the 11th U-boat the Bogue group had destroyed in 2 months. In the wardroom that night, the mood was sombre despite the victory. The men toasted quietly. Lieutenant John Davis, the group's sonar officer, scribbled in his log, "We're not fighting men anymore. We're fighting ghosts. They never see us, never hear us, just vanish beneath the sea." For the German crews, the ocean had turned from a hunting ground into a graveyard. The once proud captains who boasted of total control now lived hour to hour, haunted by the unseen menace above. An intercepted U-boat transmission from June read simply, "For days the sea hums with aircraft. We are hunted like rats. The ocean itself betrays us." By May's end, Dönitz ordered the temporary withdrawal of all Atlantic U-boats. In the Kriegsmarine's war diary, he wrote a line that marked the turning point of the entire campaign. "We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic." The Bogue's crew never saw themselves as heroes. They were sailors doing their job, methodical, unflinching, efficient. But history would remember them and their comrades as the men who broke the back of the U-boat menace. In just 90 days, the hunter-killer groups turned the tide of a war that had once seemed unwinnable. The ocean, once ruled by the wolves, now belonged to the hunters. And in the cold depths where the wrecks lay silent, the laughter of the U-boat men was gone forever, replaced by the endless, echoing hum of Allied propellers above. The wolves had ruled the seas, but now the sea itself had turned against them. The Atlantic that May was no longer the vast, ungoverned wilderness of the early war. It had become a killing ground, mapped by radar, crisscrossed by aircraft patrols, and haunted by the steady rhythm of sonar pings. For the first time since 1939, the U-boats were being annihilated faster than they could be built. In the cold light of dawn on May 23, 1943, the ocean south of Greenland roared with explosions. The convoy ONS-5, 39 merchant ships bound for Halifax, was under attack, but this time the ambush had turned against the hunters. The battle had begun 4 days earlier, when Wolfpack Fink, 19 U-boats under direct BDU command, shadowed the convoy through gales and fog. It was supposed to be a victory, Dönitz's last great gamble to prove that his undersea arm still ruled the Atlantic. But Allied intelligence, aided by ultra-decrypts, had foreseen the attack. The convoy's escort commander, Captain Johnny Walker, had prepared an ambush of his own. "Contact bearing 080, range decreasing." The sonar operator aboard the British sloop HMS Starling nearly shouted over the background roar. Walker leaned forward, his voice calm and cold. "Full ahead. Depth charges ready. Pattern Baker." The Starling heaved over the waves, turning sharply as her Aztec pings zeroed in. Beneath the surface, U-438 twisted and dove, its commander, Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Heinsohn, trying to escape the tightening web of sound. "Hard to port." "New depth, 150 meters," he barked. Then the charges fell, 5, 10, 15, exploding in a brutal concussive sequence that shook the sea itself. Metal screamed, the control room lights flickered. "Pressure hull breached!" someone yelled. Water burst through a seam near the stern. Heinsohn tried to surface, but it was too late. U-438 broke apart at 190 meters. On the surface, oil and debris boiled up to the waves. Walker's men watched in grim silence. No one cheered. The North Atlantic had taught them respect for death, even an enemy's. In his bunker at Kerneval, Dönitz stared at the latest situation map. Red pins marked U-boats overdue, black pins marked confirmed losses. In the first 3 weeks of May, 41 submarines had vanished, almost a quarter of his active Atlantic fleet. His chief of staff, Admiral Eberhard Gott, spoke softly. "The hunters have taken control of the convoy lanes." Dönitz slammed his hand on the table. "They cannot have control of the Atlantic. It is impossible." But the reports from the front were undeniable. The U-954, commanded by his own son, Peter Dönitz, had been lost with all hands on May 19th, depth-charged northeast of Iceland. The official message from the BDU's loss records read coldly: U-954 failed to report. Presumed sunk with entire crew of 50. Witnesses said Dönitz closed his office door for hours that day. When he emerged, his face was as grey as the sea outside. He would never again speak of Peter in public. For the Allies, May 1943 became the month of vindication. The hunter-killer groups, led by escort carriers like USS Bogue, USS Card, and the Royal Navy's HMS Archer, crisscrossed the Atlantic, striking wherever HF/DF intercepts led them. At Argentia, Newfoundland, Commander Daniel V. Gallery, leading the task group 21.12, briefed his pilots. "You're not protecting convoys anymore. You're hunting submarines. The difference is simple. They run, we chase." His aviators, flying Avengers and Wildcats, became the terror of the deep. Each patrol combined radar sweeps, sonar buoys, and the new Mark 24 Fido homing torpedo, the secret weapon the U-boats could neither see nor outrun. On May 21st, U-231 was caught 300 miles west of Ireland. A Bogue Avenger sighted the periscope wake, dropped a Fido, and the sea erupted moments later. The crew radioed simply, "Splash confirmed." Between May 18th and May 31st, Allied forces destroyed 41 U-boats, a record that stunned even the most optimistic strategists at Western Approach's command. German survivors told grim tales when they surfaced, those who lived long enough to be captured. Kapitänleutnant Gerhard Bigalk of U-751, rescued after his sub was sunk near the Azores, confessed under interrogation, "We were not fighting ships anymore. The ocean itself turned against us. Every sound, every ripple. It was like the sea betrayed our position." Captured documents from the Kriegsmarine War Diary echo that despair. The enemy now dominates the air and surface lanes. Radar and sonar render concealment impossible. Morale among U-boat crews declining rapidly. Many captains question further operations. The myth of the invisible hunter, the proud wolf of the Atlantic, was dead. In Washington and London, the news was electric. Prime Minister Churchill, who had once called the U-boat menace his greatest fear, sent a note to Admiral Sir Max Horton. "The Atlantic is once again a bridge, not a graveyard." For the Americans, it was a proof of concept that technology, training, and sheer persistence could overcome the terror of the deep. The new generation of escort carriers, radar, and cryptanalysis had turned the tide. But even as victory neared, the men who fought it understood the price. The sea remained merciless. Many hunter-killer ships never came home. The USS Leary and USS Buckley faced counterattacks from desperate U-boats, some fighting to the last shell. In one legendary action that June, Buckley rammed and boarded U-66, her crew engaging in a gunfight on the deck of the sinking submarine. When the battle ended, 36 Germans were rescued, including their captain. The Atlantic swallowed the rest. By summer, Dönitz conceded what he could no longer deny. On May 24, 1943, he ordered a general withdrawal of U-boats from the North Atlantic shipping lanes. In the BDU War Diary, his entry for that day read with the weight of defeat. "The enemy's defences, particularly the aircraft carriers and radar, have rendered operations in the North Atlantic impossible. The U-boat weapon must regroup. The battle is lost for now." The sentence marked a historic shift, the end of the U-boat's reign, the end of the grey wolves who had once ruled the ocean. For the Allies, it was not triumph, but survival. For the Germans, it was the collapse of faith in invincibility. As May faded into June, the Atlantic fell silent again, not with peace, but with exhaustion. The wrecks of 100 submarines lay scattered across the seabed, steel tombs filled with men who had once laughed at the soft-skinned targets of the Allies. Now the hunters laughed no more. In the archives of the Kriegsmarine, one note survives, scrawled in pencil by an anonymous U-boat officer in June 1943, weeks after the order to retreat. "We no longer command the sea. The ocean itself belongs to the enemy." And thus ended the Battle of the Atlantic, not with a grand fleet engagement, but with silence. The U-boats had been the terror of the world. Now they were ghosts, drifting in the cold, eternal dark, hunted to extinction by the very courage and technology they had once mocked. By the autumn of 1943, the North Atlantic, once the wolf's hunting ground, had gone strangely quiet. The Allied convoys still ploughed their grey, bitter lanes, escorted by destroyers, corvettes, and small carriers. The pings of sonar and hum of radar filled the nights, but the sea itself seemed emptied of predators. The U-boats had withdrawn, their commanders recalled to bases at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest, their hulls battered and their morale hollowed out. In the pens of the French coast, the submarines lay in rows, scarred, oil-stained, and half-sunk at their moorings. The great concrete bunkers, meant to symbolize invincibility, now felt like tombs. Inside one, Kapitänleutnant Hans-Jürgen Offen of the U-553, who had once prowled the Newfoundland banks with arrogance and laughter, stared at the Atlantic from a cracked observation slit. He had returned home months earlier after a failed patrol, his third in a row without sinking a ship. The last time he fired a torpedo, the wake had betrayed him, and depth charges had chased him for hours. He had surfaced in the dark, engines coughing, and turned back to base. His log entry for that day was a single line: "The hunter has become the hunted." The Kriegsmarine staff no longer spoke of victory. Their reports read like obituaries: U-643, lost in Bay of Biscay; U-414, presumed sunk off Gibraltar; U-402, sunk by aircraft from USS Card. By November, Dönitz's headquarters admitted 259 submarines destroyed in the year alone. Even the Atlantic seemed to grieve. The old rhythm of battle, the call to periscope depth, the thrill of sighting a convoy, the chase, the strike, had been replaced by static and sonar echoes. The U-boat fleet was dying not in fire, but in silence. At Kurnevel, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz convened his surviving flotilla commanders in a dimly lit war room. Maps were rolled up, pins removed. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice heavy, "our enemy has surpassed us in the science of war. To survive, we must change." On the table before them lay blueprints, sketches of a miracle that might yet reverse the tide. The electro-boot. Sleek, streamlined and powered by vast batteries, it was designed to stay submerged for days, faster underwater than on the surface. The prototypes, Type 21 and Type 23, promised to make radar and sonar useless again, to make the ocean dark once more. Dönitz's eyes gleamed for a moment. "This will be the shark of the future," he said, "but we must live long enough to build it." The room was silent. They all knew the truth. Allied bombers now pounded the submarine yards at Kiel and Hamburg nightly. Materials were scarce. Crews were dying faster than they could be trained. Meanwhile, across the sea, the Allies pressed their advantage. The US Navy's hunter-killer groups, now expanded into permanent patrol fleets, spread across the Atlantic like a vast net. Each escort carrier, armed with Avengers and Wildcats, had become a moving airfield of death. At Quonset Point Naval Air Station, new squadrons trained with sonar buoys and homing torpedoes. Pilots no longer searched for periscopes alone. They hunted the faintest radar flicker, the smallest shadow on the water. The technology evolved faster than the Germans could comprehend. Commander Daniel Gallery, whose group aboard USS Bogue had pioneered the method, wrote in his after-action report, "The U-boat has lost its advantage. We now hold the initiative, the sea, the air, and the code. That code, Enigma, had been broken months earlier at Bletchley Park, but now the flow of intelligence was constant. Every time a U-boat transmitted, Allied direction finders plotted its location within minutes. The enemy's once silent fleet had become an orchestra of betrayal, its every movement charted and predicted. In December 1943, Dönitz ordered a desperate experiment. Schnorchel, the breathing tube that allowed submarines to run their diesels while submerged. It was a clever invention, adapted from a captured Dutch design. But it came too late. In practice, the snorkel betrayed the boat almost as easily as a conning tower. Radar detected the thin metal pipe against the waves. Worse, fumes leaked inside, choking the crew. Men fainted at their posts, dizzy from carbon monoxide. In the confined air of the hull, tempers flared. The old camaraderie of the wolf packs began to collapse. One sailor from U-763 wrote in his diary, recovered after the war, "We no longer speak of hunting. We speak of surviving. Every dive feels like burial, every surfacing a gamble." By the spring of 1944, the Atlantic was no longer the front line. The war had moved ashore, to Italy, then Normandy, then France itself. The U-boats were an afterthought, used to harass the invasion fleet and carry secret cargoes. Yet still, Dönitz refused surrender. "Each boat sunk is a dagger in the enemy's trade," he told his men. But by now, few believed him. When the Allies landed in Normandy in June 1944, the German submarine bases along the Biscay coast were already under siege from the air. The skies above Lorient burned with tracer fire. The pens shook under 10,000-pound bombs that cracked the concrete roofs. Inside one shelter, Offen's new boat, U-978, prepared for what everyone knew would be a suicide patrol. The orders were brief. Intercept convoys west of Ireland, sink what you can, return if possible. As the dockhands cast off the lines, Offen turned to his first officer and said quietly, "They say we used to own the sea. Now we just borrow it for a while." U-978 slipped into the grey surf, her diesel engines humming, another ghost on borrowed time. She would survive the war, one of only a handful that did, surrendering in Trondheim in May 1945. Offen's crew was gaunt, half-starved and silent. By the war's end, 784 U-boats had been lost, more than 75% of those that ever sailed. Over 30,000 men, nearly two-thirds of Germany's submarine service, were dead. The casualty rate was higher than that of any branch in any major military of the war. In the ruins of Germany, Dönitz briefly succeeded Hitler as head of state. He surrendered the remaining U-boats in the first week of May 1945. The survivors emerged blinking from their pens, the smell of oil and death still in their uniforms. The Allies ordered all remaining U-boats scuttled. Operation Deadlight. In the cold waters off Ireland, more than 100 submarines were towed out and sunk, one after another, to prevent them from ever sailing again. British destroyer crews watched them go down without celebration. There was no victory in drowning ghosts. In 1962, at a veterans' reunion in Hamburg, a handful of surviving U-boat captains gathered for the first time since the war. They raised their glasses in silence. One of them, grey-haired and frail, was Hans-Jürgen Offen. When a journalist asked what he remembered most of the war, he replied, "The silence. Not the fighting, not the explosions. The silence afterward, when you knew the sea had taken another one of us." He paused, eyes distant. "We thought we ruled the Atlantic, but the sea never belonged to anyone. The Battle of the Atlantic ended not with flags or parades, but with an eerie calm, the kind that comes only after a storm that has burned itself out. The hunter-killer groups had done what convoys and depth charges alone could not. They had broken the will of the wolf pack. The Germans had once called it Der Atlantik, Unser Meer. But by 1945 the ocean had a new master, the alliance of technology, endurance and sacrifice. And beneath those cold grey waters, from Newfoundland to Norway, lay the rusting bones of an empire that had tried to rule the sea, and failed. Spring 1943, North Atlantic. By late April, the Atlantic was no longer the grey graveyard it had once been for Allied shipping. Something had shifted, invisibly, steadily, like the changing current beneath the keel of a ship. The hunters had become the hunted. In the darkened control room of U-456, Kapitänleutnant Weber stared at the sonar pings on his hydrophone operator's chart, hearing what every U-boat captain now dreaded, the relentless hum of radar-equipped escorts. The Allies had learned to see through the dark. The surface was no longer safe. Above the cold ocean, in the early light of dawn, a new weapon circled patiently. A B-24 Liberator of Coastal Command, its belly armed with depth charges. The black pit of the Atlantic, once beyond the reach of aircraft, was shrinking by the week. Convoy ONS-5, 40 merchantmen bound for Halifax, crawled westward under storm skies. Its escorts, destroyers and corvettes held a tight screen, their Aztec gear alive with pings and echoes. For days, wolf packs had trailed them, striking and withdrawing, but now the advantage was slipping. The convoy escorts had learned coordination, shared signals, and, most fatally for the U-boats, they hunted together. In the frigid night of May 5th, the sea erupted in fury. Hedgehog mortars burst beneath the waves, and two U-boats, U-125 and U-531, vanished forever. Weber listened to the reports through static-filled radio, his hands trembling. The convoy had lost 7 ships, but the pack had lost 7 submarines. For the first time in years, Dönitz's wolves were bleeding faster than they could kill. From the Allied command in Liverpool, Admiral Sir Max Horton studied the after-action reports. The tone was still cautious, but the numbers spoke for themselves. April 1943. 43 U-boats destroyed, the highest yet. The tide was turning, not by chance, but by machine and method, radar, code breaking, and the unyielding courage of men who had learned not just to defend, but to strike back. In his war diary, Dönitz wrote with grim resolve, "We are fighting under entirely new conditions. The enemy has closed the air gap, the losses are heavy." He still believed in the U-boat arm, still drove his men to sea, but even he could feel it. The invisible wall of Allied technology and intelligence had risen around his fleet. His wolves, once rulers of the deep, were now trapped within it. In the grey light of dawn, the Atlantic stretched calm and endless. But beneath its surface lay the graves of hundreds, German, British, Canadian, American, claimed by a war of endurance. The ocean no longer belonged to any flag. And somewhere off Greenland, the battered survivors of convoy ONS-5 pressed on toward home, their wakes like scars across the sea, proof that the Atlantic, at last, could be crossed again. The wolves had ruled for years. Now, at last, the pack was breaking.